Why do we need to maintain this caution? Actually, it is to determine whether the company's information system has met a compliance requirement. Speaking of compliance, there are actually three aspects. The first aspect can be understood as the legal part. As a company, it must abide by the law. The second part is what we call industry standards for different enterprises or different industries. Have we met the information system security standards of the corresponding industry? The third aspect of compliance is some policies we talk about. Let's give an example, like whether the branch has met the requirements of the head office. For example, the Fortune 500, right? It is possible that whether we in the Asia Pacific region meet the corresponding security policy requirements of the entire group. These three aspects are compliance requirements. Okay, let's look at the first part about laws and regulations. What about the compliance of laws and regulations? It is divided into two parts. One is this place everyone needs to understand and pay attention to. That is the law of our jurisdiction. This is very important. For example, if a foreign-funded enterprise needs to set up a factory in China or to do the corresponding information processing business, it must meet the corresponding laws and regulations of the Chinese government. That is the laws and regulations of the jurisdiction. This is very important. There are also some general laws and regulations in this. General laws and regulations. The most famous is the General Data Protection Regulation, we call it GDPR for short. I believe if you have worked in European and American companies, you should be quite familiar with GDPR. GDPR had a precursor. If we go back, it actually went from the safe harbor provision to the later privacy shield to today's general GDPR. It is to solve the handling of personal information between the US and Europe, including some cross-border flow of information assets. It must comply with some basic principles. Here we share a bit. There are several main principles of GDPR. First of all, for GDPR, it protects the owner. We call it the rights of the owner who owns the data. Then who has control over this data? For example, I can authorize someone to use it. This is the right of the owner, including how I store this data, whether I encrypt it, and when I revoke this data, these all belong to the rights of the owner. That is, I am the master of my data. You can understand it this way. So, this is the first right. The second right, generally speaking, the area where the owner is located, it's storage. That is, we generally save data in the owner. This data is generated, or the owner, the jurisdiction it designates. Here is a problem. For example, when my data in principle needs to be stored in my country, but my country's computing power is not enough. What should I do? My data may need to be processed across borders. That is to say, I may take the data of European citizens to the United States for processing. The result, after processing, I return to Europe. Here is a problem. It involves cross-border data flow. Then the third, from the perspective of storage, it should be processed locally or processed in the area where the owner is located. We just mentioned here, if processed across borders. Here is a requirement called desensitization. The reason is also easy to understand, because for example, data of European citizens, it may have some people's privacy, including phone numbers, including addresses, including personal income, including some people's hobbies. If I take this data to the United States for processing, I need to partially hide some data. Let's give a typical example. Everyone knows in daily information processing. For example, like announcing winning numbers. It usually hides the middle 4 digits of the phone number. That is, the middle 4 digits are signals, or that kind of cross. We can't see it. Can't see the whole. Please note the hidden part. Actually, it is what we call data desensitization. This data desensitization, there is another term called anonymization. It is to hide some data, but this kind of hiding is irreversible, because obviously if I anonymize and desensitize your data locally, then I take it abroad. If it can be restored, then it loses the meaning of desensitization and anonymization. So anonymization is irreversible. That is, after anonymization, it is what we call the signal or crossed out part. it cannot be restored. This is very important in GDPR. Of course, there are many things in GDPR. We will just give a few important examples. But this GDPR, there are also some legal requirements. For example, the fourth part. If, for example, my American company is processing data in Europe, then this American company, like Twitter or Facebook, it may be threatened by its own security, or there is information leakage. In principle, within 72 hours, must report to the European Data Protection Agency. Like reporting to organizations like the EU, these are some requirements for reporting new leaks. In particularly serious or particularly urgent situations, that time may be shortened to 24 hours. There will be a quantity requirement. For example, if hundreds of thousands of user data are leaked, the impact or severity is quite large, it must be faster, or notify the European owner at a higher speed, or this European Information Security Agency. This is the requirement of GDPR. In addition to some requirements of GDPR, it also has two exceptions. You need to understand this. These two exceptions are very interesting. The first is judicial. If we are responsible for evidence collection due to judicial investigation, then it may break through GDPR. When we collect evidence from criminal suspects or during judicial investigation, it can break through GDPR. When we obtain the evidence, of course, it also respects basic human rights, but it can break through some restrictions of GDPR. This is the first one. The second one is about what? About humanity. Like the World Health Organization, it may conduct some human investigations. During the epidemic, we come to count the development of the epidemic, including the number of people, including genes, including sensors. It may involve some privacy in this universal sense for the promotion or development of mankind. Some industries that contribute, it can ignore or break through some of GDPR, like the World Health Organization. We can ignore some requirements of GDPR because we are for the cause of all mankind or promoting the public welfare of all mankind. These are two exceptions. In addition to this, including companies, including governments. When we collect data, we must also respect personal privacy. So as we said about GDPR, it started as a general data protection regulation between the US and Europe. But to this day, you can consider it as general data. We can understand it as everyone in the world abides by it. Some requirements for personal privacy or some requirements for data or some legal regulations for security. In this way, it becomes a universal law. So when we deal with especially the Fortune 500 doing international business or doing international business behavior, basically follow the requirements of GDPR, obviously, whether it is legal or not, including some common internationally accepted laws. Basically, these are the requirements we must meet. In a universal sense, people around the world adhere to this requirement. This is one aspect, and another aspect is aimed at certain industries. The two main industries I would like to share with you, one is PCI DSS. PCI is what we often refer to as payment card industry. Let me give you an example. For instance, when we book tickets on CISSP, when booking tickets on CISSP might act as the payment receiver. The acquirer acts as the payment receiver. We can enter a credit card to make the payment. You can try. For example, when booking tickets, we only need to enter the credit card number, including the expiry date, validity period, including what we call the CVV code, also known as PIN, the last 3 digits of the personal identification number. That is the CVV code. Only these 3 parts are needed. We can then make the payment. This is PCI, also known as the payment card industry. So it's clear its data must be protected during the transmission process. The data must be encrypted. Because if your data is not encrypted, as we mentioned earlier, if I get the account number of a credit card user, including his expiry date, including his CVV code, I could make payments on his behalf, or I could use his account to make payments. So these are sensitive information. PCI DSS, it is aimed at the payment card industry, or we say the card business in the financial industry. it has some security protection requirements. If you want to do credit card settlement or do credit card business, whether you are the card issuer or, as we say, doing this acquiring business, you must meet PCI DSS. If you don't meet this standard, that is not on this list. Strictly speaking, you don't have the right or don't meet the business requirements to do this business, then it might not be possible. This is one. Another one is HIPAA. It is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act in the United States. Now, many countries are also protecting some medical information such as medical records, such as doctors' prescriptions. Because for hospitals, including doctors, including nurses, including the hospital's DBA, as we say, the database administrator, it could potentially cause a problem. I might have sold personal data to, for example, insurance companies, or I sold it to medical representatives. In this case, we might profit from this. This is not allowed because what we are selling is actually the patient's personal privacy. So for doctors, nurses, and the hospital's information system, they all have corresponding requirements. This is HIPAA. Up to now, it has become universal. In the medical industry, we need to protect the personal privacy of the medical industry. We usually also look at some requirements of HIPAA. Sometimes, Canada has a Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act for the management of electronic documents. It's called PCI. There are many laws and regulations. It might be proposed by a certain country or a certain organization, but after a long period of operation, it might become universal, or everyone refers to this law to do a certain industry. That's it. Or a protective requirement for some operation. Then we also need to learn this. We can consider it as a type of row marker. Of course, saying this is a bit small, but we can understand it as pertaining to a certain industry. So it includes the requirements of laws and regulations, including industry standard requirements. These are all we need to comply with